The neighborhood had always presented itself as calm, orderly, and predictably quiet, the kind of place where rules existed not for safety but for control. Every lawn was trimmed to an identical height, every mailbox stood at the same angle, and every house followed the same muted palette approved years ago by people no one remembered electing. On paper, it was a model community. In reality, it was a pressure cooker waiting for someone to make a mistake. The homeowner had lived there long enough to understand how the system worked. The HOA association operated less like a community organization and more like a silent surveillance network. Notices appeared without warning. Fines arrived without explanation. Enforcement never felt random, even though the rules claimed to be applied evenly. Some residents were invisible, others were watched closely. For years, the homeowner had stayed off the radar by doing everything required and nothing more. The lawn was maintained within regulation limits, trash bins were placed exactly where and when they were supposed to be, seasonal decorations were conservative and promptly removed. There was no interest in challenging the system, only in living peacefully within it. That peace ended the day the violation notice arrived. It came folded neatly in an official HOA envelope, slid into the mailbox with the kind of precision that suggested intent. The notice accused the homeowner of repeated rule violations related to property appearance and compliance. The language was vague but authoritative, citing general bylaws without specifics and warning of escalating fines if the behavior continued. What made the notice unsettling was not the accusation itself, but the confidence with which it was written. It assumed guilt without proof and offered no room for clarification. It framed the homeowner as a habitual rule breaker rather than a resident entitled to basic fairness. The homeowner reread the notice several times, expecting to find some obvious mistake or overlooked detail. Nothing stood out. There were no recent changes to the property, no modifications, no complaints from immediate neighbors, nothing that could reasonably justify the tone or severity of the warning. At first, the homeowner assumed it was an error, a bureaucratic misfire that would quietly resolve itself. That assumption lasted less than 24 hours. The following morning, another notice appeared. This one referenced the previous warning and implied non-compliance, despite no time having passed to correct anything. The escalation felt deliberate. The message was clear. Someone was watching closely, and someone wanted a response. As the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Notices arrived regularly, each one building on the last. The violations remained loosely defined, often repeating the same phrases without adding details. The fines increased incrementally, always stopping just short of triggering formal legal action. It was during this period that the homeowner became aware of a presence nearby. A particular neighbor had taken an unusual interest in the property. This individual was known throughout the community for their strict interpretation of HOA rules and their frequent involvement in enforcement matters. They were often seen inspecting properties, taking photos, and submitting reports to the board. This neighbor had a reputation. They were not officially part of the HOA leadership, but their influence was widely acknowledged. Complaints traced back to them more often than not. While others treated the HOA as a background annoyance, this person treated it as a personal mission. The homeowner had never interacted directly with this neighbor, but their sudden interest was impossible to miss. Each new notice seems to coincide with moments when the neighbor lingered nearby, carefully observing the property from a distance. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The accusations were not random, they were targeted. Instead of reacting emotionally, the homeowner chose patience. There was no immediate response to the notices, no public confrontation, no attempt to plead innocence. The homeowner understood that in communities like this, visible resistance often made things worse. Compliance was expected, and questioning authority was treated as defiance. Instead, the homeowner began to document everything. Every notice was dated and stored. Every alleged violation was cross-referenced with the HOA handbook. Photographs of the property were taken daily, capturing angles and details that might later be questioned. Records were kept meticulously, not with the intent to fight, but to understand. The deeper the homeowner dug into the HOA rules, the clearer the contradictions became. Many of the cited violations referenced outdated bylaws that had since been amended. Others relied on interpretations rather than concrete standards. Some rules applied only to specific zones within the neighborhood, not to the homeowner's property. What stood out most was how selectively the rules were enforced. Properties with far more visible violations went untouched. Lawns with excessive growth, unapproved structures, and improper parking existed openly throughout the neighborhood without consequence. Yet the homeowner's property, which complied in every measurable way, remained under constant scrutiny. The imbalance suggested something more than overzealous enforcement. It suggested personal motivation. As the fines accumulated on paper, the homeowner noticed another detail buried in the notices. Each violation report listed a complainant reference number. The same number appeared repeatedly. It did not identify a name, but it established a pattern. One source was responsible for nearly all the complaints. The homeowner didn't need confirmation to know who it was. Rather than confront the situation directly, the homeowner shifted focus. If the rules were being weaponized, then understanding those rules better than anyone else became essential. The HOA handbook, once an afterthought, became required reading. Every clause was reviewed, every footnote examined. Amendments, exceptions, and enforcement limitations were highlighted. What emerged was not a system of order, but a web of inconsistencies. The HOA claimed broad authority, but its actual power was constrained by procedure. Many enforcement actions required board review, documentation, and due process. Anonymous complaints were permitted, but only if independently verified. Repeat fines required evidence of unresolved violations. None of those safeguards appeared to be followed. The homeowner began to suspect that the HOA board was relying heavily on reports from trusted residents without verification. The neighbor's reputation as a rule enforcer may have granted them unchecked influence. Complaints were accepted at face value, processed automatically, and passed along without investigation. This realization reframed the entire situation. The homeowner was not facing an impartial organization enforcing community standards. They were facing a system being manipulated by someone who believed rules existed to control others, not to be applied fairly. The stress of the situation weighed heavily, but it also sharpened the homeowner's resolve. There was no intention to retaliate recklessly or escalate publicly. If the HOA wanted to play by the rules, then the rules would be followed precisely, including those the self-appointed enforcer may have overlooked. What the homeowner did next was quiet, methodical, and entirely within the boundaries of compliance. Instead of focusing solely on defending against the accusations, the homeowner began observing the neighborhood more closely. The same attention once directed at their own property was now extended outward, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain properties appeared immune to enforcement despite clear violations. One property in particular stood out. The same neighbor responsible for the complaints lived there. Their home, often presented as an example of HOA perfection, revealed subtle inconsistencies when viewed through the lens of the rulebook. Measurements did not align. Modifications appeared unapproved. Maintenance standards cited in the handbook were not met as strictly as advertised. None of these observations were assumptions. They were documented facts cross-referenced against HOA regulations. The homeowner did not act on this information immediately. There was no rush. The goal was not revenge, but balance. If rules were to be enforced, they needed to be enforced evenly. As the chapter closed, the homeowner stood at a crossroads. Continue absorbing fines and hoping the pressure would fade, or step forward with evidence that challenged the very system being used against them. The next move would determine whether the accusations would quietly disappear or whether the spotlight would shift entirely. And for the first time since the notices began, the homeowner realized something important. The rules that were being used as weapons could also be used as shields.
The decision to respond formally did not come from anger or fear, but from calculation. The homeowner understood that silence had been interpreted as weakness and compliance had been assumed without verification. If the situation was going to change, it would not be through emotional appeals or public scenes. It would change through documentation, structure, and an understanding of the system better than the system understood itself. The first step was simple but deliberate. A written request was submitted to the HOA asking for detailed clarification on each cited violation. The request followed every procedural requirement outlined in the bylaws, including timelines, formatting, and delivery method. Nothing about it could be dismissed as informal or incomplete. It demanded specifics without sounding confrontational. What followed was not clarity, but delay. Days passed without response, then weeks. The fines continued to appear, each one referencing unresolved violations that still had not been explained. The HOA's silence spoke volumes. It suggested that the enforcement process relied on pressure rather than proof, and that accountability was not something the board expected to face. Rather than becoming discouraged, the homeowner doubled down on organization. A comprehensive timeline was created, documenting every notice, every fine, and every unanswered request. The homeowner printed copies of the HOA handbook, highlighting relevant sections and cross-referencing them with the accusations. Each inconsistency was flagged, each procedural failure was noted. It became increasingly clear that the HOA was operating on autopilot, processing complaints without oversight. The same reference number continued to appear on the violation notices, reinforcing the conclusion that the enforcement effort was driven by a single source. Meanwhile, the homeowner's observations of the neighborhood continued. The neighbor who had initiated the complaints maintained a visible presence, frequently walking the area with an air of authority that did not come from any official position. Their property remained outwardly pristine, but the homeowner now knew better than to accept appearances at face value. Using the HOA's own publicly available rules, the homeowner began documenting conditions objectively. Measurements were taken from public vantage points. Photographs were captured without intrusion. Everything was done carefully, legally, and without interaction. What emerged was a quiet contradiction. The neighbor's property contained multiple elements that did not align with current HOA standards. Some were minor but undeniable. Others were more significant, involving structural changes that required approval documentation the HOA was obligated to keep on record. The homeowner submitted a formal records request to the HOA asking for approval documents related to those modifications. This request, like the previous one, followed every rule. It was polite, concise, and impossible to ignore without violating their own procedures. The response came faster this time. The HOA acknowledged receipt and requested additional time to gather the documents. That acknowledgement alone confirmed something important. The request had reached a point of discomfort. The board could no longer rely on automated enforcement without scrutiny. As the waiting period continued, the homeowner noticed a shift in behavior. The frequency of violation notices slowed. The fines stopped increasing. The pressure, once constant, eased slightly. It was subtle, but meaningful. The system was reacting. When the HOA finally delivered the requested records, the results were incomplete. Several approvals were missing. Others referenced outdated rules or temporary exceptions that had long since expired. The documentation did not support the neighbor's compliance. The homeowner did not celebrate. This was not a victory yet. It was leverage. Rather than immediately submitting a complaint, the homeowner took another step back. The goal was not to expose one neighbor, but to reveal a pattern. If selective enforcement could be demonstrated clearly, the HOA's entire position would weaken. To that end, the homeowner requested enforcement records for the past 2 years, specifically records showing how often violations were issued, resolved, or escalated. The request was narrow enough to be reasonable, but broad enough to reveal inconsistencies. This time, the HOA hesitated. Deadlines were missed, extensions were requested, responses became vague. It was clear the board had not anticipated this level of scrutiny from a resident they had labeled a rule breaker. Behind the scenes, the homeowner continued compiling evidence. The file grew thicker by the day. Screenshots, photographs, timelines, and excerpts from the bylaws formed a narrative that contradicted the HOA's actions entirely. The more the picture became, the clearer the truth appeared. The HOA was not enforcing rules evenly. It was outsourcing authority to certain residents, allowing personal grievances to dictate official actions. The neighbor who had reported the homeowner repeatedly was not only benefiting from this arrangement, but actively exploiting it. And they were not as careful with their own compliance as they believed. The homeowner finally submitted a formal appeal regarding the original violations. The appeal was detailed, structured, and supported by evidence. It challenged not only the accusations, but the process itself. It cited procedural failures, lack of verification, and inconsistent enforcement. For the first time, the HOA was forced to confront the possibility that their authority had been misused. The appeal triggered an internal review, not a public one, not an immediate one, but enough to cause visible tension within the board. Meetings were rescheduled. Notices stopped arriving entirely. The silence this time felt different. It was no longer dismissive. It was cautious. Meanwhile, the neighbor responsible for the complaints appeared increasingly unsettled. Their once confident patrols of the neighborhood became less frequent. Their attention shifted inward as though they sensed the spotlight turning. The homeowner did not engage. There was no need. The system was beginning to do the work on its own. As the chapter closed, the homeowner received confirmation that the appeal would be reviewed alongside enforcement records. The implications were significant. If the review proceeded honestly, it would expose not just one unjust accusation, but a broader failure of governance. The balance of power was changing, and the neighbor who once confidently labeled someone else a rule breaker was about to discover what happened when rules were finally applied without favoritism.
The internal review did not begin with urgency or transparency. It began quietly, behind closed doors, shielded from the residents who had unknowingly funded an HOA that had grown comfortable operating without accountability. On the surface, nothing appeared to change. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still aligned. The illusion of order remained intact. But beneath that calm exterior, the machinery of enforcement had stalled, and for the first time, the gears were grinding instead of spinning freely. The homeowner noticed the shift almost immediately. Weeks passed without a single violation notice. The mailbox, once a source of anxiety, became unremarkable again. The absence of fines was not framed as resolution or apology. It was simply silence, the kind of silence that suggested deliberation rather than dismissal. Behind that silence, records were being reviewed. The appeal had forced the HOA board into unfamiliar territory. They were no longer reacting to complaints. They were being asked to justify them. That distinction mattered. The homeowner's appeal did not attack the authority of the HOA directly. Instead, it challenged the method by which that authority had been exercised. It asked uncomfortable questions about verification, consistency, and compliance with their own bylaws. Those questions required answers. As board members examined enforcement logs, a troubling pattern emerged. Certain names appeared repeatedly as complainants, certain properties appeared repeatedly as targets, and just as consistently, some properties never appeared at all, regardless of their visible condition. The neighbor responsible for the original complaints was impossible to ignore. Their reference number dominated the reports. Their influence was not documented officially, but it was undeniable statistically. The board could no longer claim impartial enforcement when the data told a different story. What complicated matters further was the condition of that neighbor's own property. The missing approval documents raised red flags. Temporary exceptions had expired years earlier. Modifications once allowed under outdated rules no longer met current standards. And yet, enforcement had never followed. No warnings, no fines, no notices. The homeowner did not need to be present for this realization to land. The evidence spoke clearly on its own. The review expanded. What began as an appeal regarding one homeowner quietly transformed into an audit of enforcement practices. Board members who had relied on automation and trusted reports were now forced to acknowledge how little oversight existed.
Complaints had been accepted without independent verification. Enforcement actions had been issued without documented inspections. Appeals were rare, and when they occurred, they were often resolved informally without correction. The system had been built for convenience, not fairness. As the scope of the review widened, so did its consequences. The HOA's legal counsel was consulted, not for litigation, but for risk assessment. Selective enforcement was not just unethical, it was legally dangerous. If challenged publicly, it could expose the association to significant liability. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The homeowner was no longer viewed as a rule breaker. They were now the reason the HOA had discovered its own vulnerabilities. The board's focus turned inward, toward damage control rather than punishment. Meanwhile, the neighbor who had initiated the complaints began to feel the pressure indirectly. Their confidence, once rooted in assumed authority, began to crack. They could sense the change, even if they did not yet understand it fully. Enforcement notices that once flowed freely now stalled. Informal influence no longer carried the same weight. The homeowner observed this change from a distance.
The final ruling from the HOA did not arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic announcement, no public admission of fault, and no acknowledgement of how close the association had come to exposing itself to legal consequences. Instead, the decision was delivered in the most HOA way possible, quietly, formally, and wrapped in language designed to minimize responsibility. The homeowner's appeal was approved. The violations were dismissed in full. The fines were voided. The record was cleared. The HOA framed the outcome as a result of procedural review rather than error. There was no apology, no explanation, but the result spoke louder than any statement ever could. The narrative of the homeowner as a repeat rule breaker was officially erased. That erasure sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who had quietly watched the situation unfold now understood what had happened. The HOA had been forced to back down. The system, once rigid and unchallenged, had bent under scrutiny. The idea that enforcement was absolute began to crumble. Behind the scenes, the board scrambled to stabilize the damage. The internal review did not stop with the appeal. Once the inconsistencies had been uncovered, they could not be ignored. Legal counsel recommended immediate corrective action to prevent future claims of selective enforcement. That meant revisiting how complaints were handled, how inspections were conducted, and how influence was allowed to shape outcomes. One change became apparent almost immediately. Anonymous complaints were no longer accepted without independent verification. Enforcement actions now required documented inspections. Reference numbers that once fast-tracked violations lost their power. For the first time in years, the HOA operated as an organization instead of an echo chamber. The neighbor who had once fueled the enforcement machine felt the effects of this shift most sharply. Their property, now fully exposed to the same scrutiny they had applied to others, could no longer hide behind reputation. Outstanding violations were not dismissed or delayed, deadlines were enforced, exceptions were revoked. What made the situation especially difficult was that the neighbor had built their identity around rule enforcement. Their authority was not official, but it had been real in practice. Losing that influence was not just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. The homeowner observed the unraveling from a distance. There was no gloating, no celebration. The process had always been about correction, not revenge. The outcome was simply the logical conclusion of applying rules evenly. As the HOA adjusted its policies, residents began noticing tangible changes. Notices became more detailed. Violations included photographs and measurements. Appeals were acknowledged promptly. Meetings were structured and documented. The association was becoming transparent out of necessity. The neighbors' attempts to reassert influence failed repeatedly. Complaints were filed but not acted upon. Reports were questioned rather than accepted. The board no longer treated any resident as an extension of its authority. Isolation replaced influence. The homeowner, once a target, became a quiet example. Other residents
The changes within the HOA did not end with corrected enforcement or revised procedures. Those adjustments were necessary, but they were not enough to erase the damage caused by years of unchecked authority. The internal review had exposed more than selective enforcement. It had revealed a leadership structure that operated without meaningful accountability. Once that truth surfaced, it could not be ignored. The board understood this, even if they never said it openly. The risk was no longer legal alone, it was reputational. Residents had begun paying attention, asking questions and requesting records. Transparency, once treated as an inconvenience, became unavoidable. The first sign of deeper change came quietly. A scheduled board meeting was postponed, then rescheduled, then reformatted. The agenda, once vague and tightly controlled, expanded to include policy review, enforcement procedures, and resident participation. The shift was subtle but deliberate. The homeowner did not attend. There was no need. The homeowner had already accomplished what most residents never believed was possible. The system had been forced to correct itself, not through confrontation, but through structure and persistence. Still, the effects of that correction continued to ripple outward. Board members began stepping down. Some cited personal reasons. Others referenced time constraints. No explanations were given, but the timing spoke for itself. Leadership turnover followed scrutiny, not coincidence. New faces emerged. Residents who had once kept their heads down now stepped forward. They were not motivated by power, but by stability. They understood what had gone wrong and why it mattered. Their approach to governance emphasized clarity over control and consistency over convenience. The HOA elections, once predictable and poorly attended, became contested. Participation increased. Ballots were returned in numbers the association had not seen in years. The culture shifted. The neighbor who had once wielded influence through constant reporting watched these changes unfold from the sidelines. Their role in the community diminished steadily. Without the board's implicit support, their complaints held no special weight. Without enforcement leverage, their authority dissolved entirely. Their property compliance issues were resolved eventually, not because of leniency, but because there was no alternative. The same rules applied to everyone now, including them. The transformation was complete. The homeowner experienced something unexpected as the months passed. Normalcy. No notices, no fines, no silent surveillance. The mailbox returned to its original purpose. The neighborhood felt less rigid, less tense. Lawns were still maintained, rules still existed, but enforcement no longer carried an undercurrent of intimidation. The homeowner remained observant, but no longer defensive. The experience left behind a lasting awareness